All right, hello everyone. Today we are going to be discussing a very important and current topic, which is actually the transgender experience in the workforce. Specifically, we're actually going to be delving into a comparison between what it's like to be a trans person in both the United States and Russia. But before we do get started with that, we do want to begin with some introductions. So my name is Jalen.
I'm Keaton.
I am Saul.
I'm Sam.
I'm Anna.
Okay, perfect. So now that we all know each other, we can go ahead and get started. And before we do kind of jump into everything and discussing our material, we do want to begin with a really quick trigger warning. And just kind of warning everyone that throughout the presentation, we will be discussing several different topics that may be triggering to some individuals. And this does include the current Russian and United States politics, as well as various incidents of LGBTQ plus violence, which could potentially lead to some emotional distress for some of the viewers. And we do want to clarify as well that there will only be discussion of events and topics that have occurred within the past 10 years. And if you do need any emotional support after this presentation, then we definitely do recommend checking out these two great resources that are linked on our screen right here. One of them is going to be discussing the current situation with Russia and Ukraine and the varying ways that you can help both yourself emotionally and also those who are in need of support in those countries. And the other link is going to be to various different hotlines offering support to trans and queer individuals who may be in need of it. But we can go ahead and move on to our brief little layout of our presentation today. We are going to begin with a quick little overview of the key terms that are going to be used throughout our presentation today. I'm providing the definitions so that everyone's aware of each topic we're discussing. And then we're going to dive into an overview of Russia, where we talk about the social and cultural context of these countries, as well as the legal context and the workplace barriers that are existing for trans individuals. And following this, we will also be discussing the same topics with the United States, this time instead of Russia. And to finish off our presentation, we will then be doing a comparison of these two countries that are followed by some possible recommendations that we have to offer as well. All right, but to officially start us off, let's go ahead and begin with some key terms and the definitions that go along with them that we're going to be using throughout our presentation today. Specifically, we're going to be discussing gender identity, which is brought up through our PowerPoint. And this refers to the internal knowledge of your gender. For example, your knowledge of your gender identity as a man, a woman, or any other gender. And differing from this, we do have gender expression, which focuses on more of a visual aspect. This is going to be how a person presents their gender on the outside, although most times this is going to be through behavior, hairstyles, or voice and body characteristics as well. And we do also want to clarify that the definition for the term transgender is actually a more broad term that's used to describe those who have a gender identity that is different from their gender that they thought to be when they were born. You also may notice throughout our presentation that we use the word trans, and that's just in this case refers to transgender, just a shortened version. And legal gender recognition is going to be another term that we use, and is something that not all trans people need or want, but for many it is a very critical step in their transition. And if anyone is curious about any other terms that we use today or want to learn any more about the ones that we just discussed, then I definitely recommend checking out our National Center for Transgender Equality. But moving on from this, I'll go ahead and pass it on over to Keaton to keep us going.
All right, thanks, Jalen. So on this slide, we're just kind of looking at providing you with a little background about Russia as a country. So the type of government that Russia has is technically a federation with a semi-presidential republic. However, so they have elections. Vladimir Putin is the current head of state. However, over the years, Russia has continued to centralize power. Russia is also geographically the largest country in the world. It is the 12th largest economy in the world as well. So it is a very geographically diverse. It's also demographically diverse. Specifically for our presentation today, most of our research is focused on major metropolitan areas. We didn't so much look at research in more rural parts of the country as something to keep in mind as we move forward. The next two points about Russia that we chose to share today, Russia, it is we're looking at some indices that are taken by the World Bank. The first one is the voice and accountability parameter. And this measure is the extent to which a country's citizens are able to participate in selecting their government, as well as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and availability of free media. And the scales are on as 0 to 100, 0 being the lowest possible score, 100 being the highest. And for that, Russia scores around 19.8. The second indice that we looked at was rule of law parameter. Again, same idea, 0 being the lowest, 100 being the highest. And rule of law measures the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by rules of society. So the quality of contract enforcement, the police, courts, likelihood of crime and violence, and Russia scores 22.6. Percentile on that. And just for some comparison, China scores 52.8 on that indice. Russia also has a official state religion, and it is Russian Orthodox Christianity. On this slide, we are going to look at a short clip from a documentary that was created in 2018 called Big Open Closet, Trans in Russia. The filmmakers are Fox and Owl, who are a non-binary trans couple who traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, to create a documentary about the annual Pride Festival that takes place there called Queer Fest. In this clip, you'll see them interviewing Johnny, who is a transgender man in St. Petersburg who is involved in organizing Queer Fest, and they are giving some information, a little bit more context about Russian history and different social cultural elements.
Russia has a history of a very violent history of prison camps and these masculine violent communities where sexual abuse, including homosexual abuse, was a way to construct an hierarchy in the society. Most transphobic attacks and abuses are against trans women and trans feminine people because, well, as a construct, a man who lets go of his masculinity is perceived as someone very weak and something that just shouldn't exist. It's not only about gender and queerness, it's about disability, it's about race, it's about your ethnicity, about your mental health, about anything. As soon as you recognize that you're not fitting into the major normative, you're just nobody.
Yeah, so that just provides a little bit more information kind of about, just the different contextual factors that go on in Russia related to the LGBTQ plus community. On this slide, we are calling out just some notable laws and events that have passed and occurred in Russia. Again, focusing only on post-Soviet Russia. So first one we have listed here is that in 1983, homosexual relationships were decriminalized. And then in 1997, transgender Russians were legally allowed to change their gender marker. In 2000, we included this on our list because it definitely impacts trans women at work in Russia. But in 2000, Vladimir Putin signed into law it's called the No Women Jobs list, where women were barred from working in 56 professions. In 2013, the gay propaganda law was enacted in Russia. In 2019, Putin thankfully shortened the No Women's Job list to 100 restricted jobs, but it does still exist. In 2020, the Russian Constitution legally included a definition of marriage as being a union between a man and a woman. And proposed a law banning same-sex marriage and trans adoption. In 2020, however, a positive for the LGBTQ plus community was that a trans woman won a court case against a former employer. She was fired from her job after having her legal gender changed. And then in 2021, the bill did pass and became law, where same-sex marriage and trans adoption is banned in Russia.
All right, perfect. So now I'm going to take some time talking about a very critical law that was put in place that is currently harming the queer community that is in Russia. And this law is actually referred to as the gay propaganda law, and is actually banning the access of information on LGBTQ plus identifying individuals to all of the youth in Russia. And this is extremely harmful, having this law in place for this marginalized community by denying access to essential information that can actually ease their fear of feeling outcasted from others. And we are actually seeing direct results in Russia since the passing of this law when viewing a recent uptick in violent anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes. So you can just directly see the negative and harmful effects that this is having on Russian queer counterparts. And beyond this, it is also actively creating this false perception that queer identifying individuals are perverted and less than their cis straight counterparts. So lots of different harmful effects that we were able to notice after having this gay propaganda law put into place. And now I want to go ahead and take us to our next slide, which has a quote from an anonymous Russian child psychologist that we found when conducting some research on this specific law. And it just speaks volumes on the negative effects that we are able to see. And they said specifically that as of today, teachers and teacher psychologists are not allowed to speak positively on LGBT topics. They can't just say to a kid, hey, everything is normal with you. And we just think that that speaks so many volumes on this, because childhood exposure is just so necessary in identifying a community and finding our sense of self within you. And this directly carries over into the workforce as well, and the effects that it has on trans adults, which leads us to this perfect video that just really encapsulates the whole experience of what the trans life is like in Russia specifically. And it actually goes into the life of Eva, and she touches on the different harassment that she faces in Russia as a trans woman, as well as the different resources that she actually has available to.
Вопрос достаточно очень щекотливый вообще в целом в России на тему табу. То есть я через многое прошла, я и через травлю, и в интернете, и вживую. Меня и избивали, подлавливали, по-всякому пытались заткнуть. Вот. Я веду свой YouTube-канал, но также я в Инстаграме и хэштегами своими показываю о том, что я трансгендерная девушка. Никогда не скрывала то, что я трансгендерная девушка. Наоборот, веду открытый образ жизни для того, чтобы люди узнали, что такие, как я, люди мы есть.
All right, so moving on to our next topic, we wanted to address the legal gender recognition process in Russia. It is a very long, complicated process that often takes people years to complete. And to even begin the process, transgender people in Russia must go through a psychiatric evaluation, it typically resulting in a 1-month-long stay in a psychiatric hospital where they have to be diagnosed with transsexualism. In 2018, the World Health Organization updated their disease manual that no longer includes or classifies transsexualism as a disease. So this is something that is not consistent with world standards for mental health. Following that, transgender people then have to obtain a medical certificate saying that they have either undergone hormonal replacement therapy and or gender reassignment surgery. And then they have to then apply and receive judgment to amend their birth record, which after that, then they can finally replace all other documents. Um, legal gender recognition and the barriers that are in place to obtaining that cause significant workplace discrimination. Looking at this slide, we have a few statistics from 2 surveys. One survey from 2016 done by the Transgender Legal Defense Project in Russia that surveyed 242 different transgender people. And then the second survey was done in 2021 by Coming Out, which is a LGBTQ plus organization in St. Petersburg involving over 1,200 people. The findings of this, primarily the employment denials, so 50% of transgender people experience employment denials, 62% say that they choose not to change jobs or apply for attractive job vacancy. Also, the surveys found that 62% of transgender survey participants earn less than 30,000 rubles a month. Average income in Russia is around 52,000, so much less than that. And often this is a result of someone's, the way that they present, their way they look, not matching with their ID. And we have one more clip for you, and this is just a note from the same documentary you were watching earlier, just talking about the way that the rest of the world kind of views this community in Russia and what we can do.
The event happened without a hitch, and we met so many amazing trans people. Often, people speak about queer people in Russia, and they talk about how brave they are to be out, and speak as if they need to be saved by more progressive countries.
But it's not about them being brave, and they don't need to be saved by us or anyone that doesn't live in their community and culture. All we can do is support them on their own terms. They need to lead the way.
Moving on to some background on the United States. The United States operates as a state of democracy. Unlike Russia, we have a very democratic process for a lot of our laws. It is also the largest economy in the world. Looking at some of the statistics that we saw with Russia, the United States scored a 72.94 percentile on the voice and accountability parameter. This gives people a lot of say in the actions that they have and a lot of freedom in what they talk about, which is one of our amendments. So I'm glad to see it's represented a little bit there. We also rank 88.46 in the rule of law parameter. We have very strict laws and we do expect our citizens to follow them. Not quite as strict as other countries, but a lot more strict than like European countries, which are a bit more flexible. And then the majority of our population is Christian, coming in at 70.6%. Although we claim to be a country of religious diversity, the overwhelming majority does fall under this category of Christian.
All right, as for the US, we can begin looking at the emerging LGBTQ community. More specifically, we can take a look into the embracement period during the Obama presidency term from 2009 to 2017. The Obama presidency really gave LGBTQ members a new sense of hope in mission to break down barriers set by society regarding their sexual identities and orientations. Some ways we see the Obama administration begin to break down the barriers in the workforce is by instating the Global Equity Fund, which is a public-private partnership of government and private entities that are dedicated to protecting and defending the human rights and fundamental freedoms of lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgenders, and intersex people around the world. And even since 2011, they have already allocated over $30 million to civil society organizations in over 80 different countries around the world. We also begin to see more laws emerge aiming at protecting LGBTQ people. We see the new changes in law new changes in the law, like the 1969 Hate Crime Prevention Act, that in 2009 under Obama helped extend coverage of the federal hate crime laws which help cover attacks based on victims' actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identities, or disabilities. So this gives the community just greater inclusion in the workforce, allowing them to protect under any employer, and allowing legal action to take place when discrimination occurs against them. A key turning point outside of the Obama administration has been the importance of the Bostock versus Clayton County ruling. In 2020, this case determined and helped recognize that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protected employees against discrimination because they are gay or transgender. This allowed greater increase in the transgender employees entering the workforce, alongside that giving them a voice that they can integrate as a newly accepting workforce. As we continue looking at the LGBT community, the oppressions begin to shift from Obama to Donald Trump, whose presidency during 2017 to 2021 initiated by instituting a ban on transgender service members within the US military. This created much tension among the working transgender individuals and the politics behind these changes. Anxiety rose as workers feared their jobs at home might not be secured as they once thought. A strong barrier right now for the trans individuals is the Equality Act proposal. It's not being passed by Congress yet, but if it were passed, it could help express sexual orientation and gender identity as prohibited grounds of employment discrimination under federal law. So more closely protecting transgender employees in more than just employment, also including protection in housing and credit discrimination. Lastly, we see the trans and LGBTQ members oppressed by healthcare barriers implemented against their accessibility. In 2021, we saw more than 110 anti-trans bills proposed, and the government was just making it more difficult to access healthcare. And they seek to narrow down the definition of sex discrimination through the Affordable Care Act, just making it harder for transgender people to attain healthcare.
So I'm going to be talking about some of the barriers that trans people face going into the education system. There are a lot of hardships that they face, particularly in the education sector. 2 out of 5 trans girls reported having to leave school early or being expelled because of gender-based mistreatment. This is a really big number, especially for elementary school. Like, this is something that you wouldn't expect to see in children that little, but it's represented at a very young age and only develops as people progress through school. Additionally, 1 in every 4 transgender women reported experiencing an assault of some form in college. Again, like, looking at the amount of people that face assault in college, the fact that 1 out of every 4 of them is a transgender woman, that is a very large number. Every 2 out of 5 trans women have reported leaving college because of some form of mistreatment. These barriers contribute heavily to the lack of representation of trans women in the workplace by not providing a safe environment for trans women to get an education that they need to pursue higher paying jobs. We see a really big lack of trans women in high paying jobs, particularly in the STEM sector, because they fail to finish their education because of the mistreatment and the barriers that they experience in there. There also was a really big lack of portrayal of transgender individuals within like media and representation. This is a really big thing. A lot of the times when we see like ads for colleges, they're like, everyone is like, oh, like that person looks like me. Like, I can see myself going to college because I have seen proof that somebody who looks like me, somebody who acts like me is there doing the same thing and I can be successful. But with trans people, we don't see that same representation, and it can be really discouraging, especially to younger people who don't see people who look like them in the media. Looking at some of the impacts on employment, like I talked about in my last slide, there are a lot of barriers that trans women face in education that leads to a large drop of trans women in the workforce. Unemployment is 3 times higher in the trans population than in any other population that we see. For the individuals who beat the barriers that they face in education and go on to get a job, they are met in the workforce by little assistance from the harassment that they face. Although there are laws set in place to protect them in the hiring process, there is nothing to protect them from the harassment that they face from their own peers. Particularly, this is an issue with people who have transitioned after already being hired. We see a lot of harassment by coworkers failing to use their pronouns or just having a general problem. Like a lot of clients might not like that you're transitioned, or like might be confused on like how they were like suddenly talking to one person and now it's like a lot of people can't really grasp that concept. And if you're starting out in a workplace that already has you like as this construct in your head, and then you transition and you come out and you change in that way, there can be a lot of complications and resistance met with that. Additionally, there are a lot of wage cuts that people face if they transition after being hired. They've found that their wage gets to cut about a third after they have transitioned, which is a really large pay decrease. And I can't believe that that is not illegal, but it is definitely one of the barriers that trans people deal with in the workplace.
Okay, so when comparing some of the experiences that Russia and the United States kind of go through, so in terms of legislatively, we see a lot of progression and regression between both countries. While Russia has made like monumental steps through decriminalization of homosexual relationships in 1993, and even allowing for transgenders to legally change their gender markers in 1997. We see this regress later with the gay propaganda laws in 2013. And this is also similar to the United States, where we see a lot of older laws passed, kind of amend and adapt to protect transgender laws. But recently, through like the Texas transgender child abuse laws, that's kind of seen as an attempt to kind of criminalize again and prosecute transgenders for certain age groups. And we also have the Florida's Don't Say Gay bill currently, which kind of hurts the education of transgenders, like seen in Russia. Yeah, so we can see similarities between Russia's trend to the United States, and while it's unfair to critique the US in the same manner as Russia's regression, it is very concerning on how much progress has been undone recently, both culturally and legislatively. And some of the differences, the United States provides more progressive environment and greater freedom of expression. This kind of adds to the concern because as we see some of the progress being undone, in the United States, we do have that privilege to actively participate in politics. Another difference between is both the countries' state religions. As discussed, Russia has a de facto state religion with the Russia Orthodoxy, while the United States practices a separation of church and state. And we can kind of see this through the influence of the legislation passed. And then in terms of the recommendations, as discussed in the video, Russia kind of needs to lead the way with their LGBTQ plus communities, but it's important to also garner support from more liberal nations. And through educating and reform, the Russian-led changes will lead to longer lasting outcomes and shift Russian social perspectives as well. Through adapting to global medical standards and declassifying transgender as a human illness, the transgender community will also be more humanized and help in the fight for more civil rights. And because of recent regressions and challenges made to the trans community and their civil rights, this is especially important in stride. Currently, the trans community is underrepresented and discriminated against seeking healthcare as well. And then in terms of the US, it's important for these laws to have more written down in legislative writing because we want to prevent a backslide as seen in Russia. But yeah. And then, yeah, so for the global perspective slide, I think this just illustrates and highlights how recent a lot of the US legislations are. And this is both encouraging the fact that how much progress we have made. We also have to be cautious because while these laws are relatively new, we don't want to see that backslide as we did in Russia. And this also helps illustrate countries' trends as they start pursuing more protection and a progressive environment for transgenders. And also, this stresses the progress needed to be made globally and supported through from progressive nations. This also kind of highlights, I think, a misconception with how the US is leading in progressive manners, as we can see other countries actually kind of take the initiative. Yeah, that's just one surprising thing I kind of found to this graph. And also, just because this presentation is pretty short and it's kind of pertains to such a significant and large topic, we also highly encourage you to do more research on the topic, whether that's through the resources that we found or personal research on your own.
Yeah, and we just want to thank everyone so much for sticking with us through this presentation and hearing our perspective on this very important topic. And here are our references that we did rely on throughout our presentation. Yeah, and thank you so much again.